Hello, and welcome to the EDRM Global Webinar channel. I'm Craig Ball. I'm privileged to serve as EDRM's General Counsel, and especially privileged today to be filling in for the marvelous Mary Mack while she's enjoying a well-deserved vacation. Today's webinar is an EDRM collaboration with our trusted partner, eDiscovery Today. Our webinar today is entitled the fourth annual eDiscovery Today State of the Industry Report Survey Results. And our faculty expert is my good friend and industry thought leader, Doug Austin. We welcome your questions and your feedback in the console. Questions will be answered during and always at the end of the webinar. And this webinar will be made available to you for replay at your convenience during the next quarter, as will all our prior EDRM webinars. Kaylee Wallstedt, EDRM's Chief Strategy Officer, is here with us. Kaylee, please share what resources are available to listeners today.
Thanks so much, Craig, and we are thrilled to have you standing in for Mary, very special Master Ball. We appreciate it so much. Well, we're loving EDRM's On24 platform with so many more ways for you, our special audience, to engage. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see your console. There's a question mark icon. Click that, and you can type in your questions for today's faculty. As Craig said, slides will be made available after the webinar has concluded. Click the paperclip for related content specially curated for you today. There is a link to download On24's engagement tool descriptions to help you better engage. You can click the link to subscribe to eDiscovery Today's blog and never miss a thing. There is a link to learn more about Craig Ball, and be sure to subscribe to his amazing Ball in Your Court blog. There's also a link to learn how to get your copy of the 45-page chock full of information 4th Annual State of the Industry Report. Up next on EDRM's webinar channel, next week on January 17th, zeroing in on Zendesk, collecting data and metadata for eDiscovery and compliance. Be sure to save your seats. And just like Zoom, you'll see the smiley face emoji. And there's many more reactions that you can click and show some love to today's faculty. Give it a try right now. We highly encourage you to engage with them. We're having a lot of fun with them on our platform. And the Twitter bird is where you can follow EDRM, eDiscovery Today, and Craig Ball on LinkedIn. And back to you, Craig.
Thank you, Kaylee. I should note that all opinions that will be expressed by Doug and by me during this presentation are our personal opinions and not intended to reflect upon our clients or firms. We are also not seeking to provide legal advice in this context. Let me begin by introducing my good friend and one of the most admired thought leaders in the electronic discovery community, Doug Austin. Doug is the editor-in-chief of EDRM's trusted partner, eDiscovery Today. He's an established eDiscovery thought leader with over 30 years of experience, providing eDiscovery best practices, legal technology consulting, technical project management services, and all of his insight to numerous commercial and government clients. Doug has achieved something extraordinary in that he's published a daily blog since 2010 and written so many articles and white papers, too numerous to mention here. He received the J.D. Supra Reader's Choice Award as the top eDiscovery author for both 2017 and 2018, and a J.D. Supra Reader's Choice Award as a top cybersecurity author for 2019. EDRM thanks Doug for his service to the EDRM Global Advisory Council, to the eDiscovery community, and especially for the opportunity to sponsor his annual State of the Industry survey from its inception. Please, Doug, take it away.
Well, thanks, Craig, and thanks for that terrific introduction. And hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar to discuss the results from the 2024 State of the Industry report that was published by eDiscovery today, earlier this week. So here is a list of the topics we have to talk about. Certainly, we're going to start by just kind of recapping what the State of the Industry report is and a little bit of history as we are in our fourth year. And then we're actually going to get down into the nitty-gritty in terms of the report highlights. We'll touch on the demographics, and then we will really get into the survey results, as well as provide some selected thought leader observations on some of the same topics. So we'll provide consolidated responses to questions. We'll provide a breakdown of different response groups because we did have enough respondents to break out 4 different groups. And we'll provide some year-over-year comparisons for some of the questions we ask year after year. And as you can see there with that last bullet point, we encourage questions. And given that this is going to be a case where we're going to be talking about survey results and certainly give some observations about that, and Craig will certainly do that as well, we encourage comments. If you all have any particular observations as well as questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And Craig already covered the disclaimer, so we will jump right past that. So the State of the Industry report is published every year by eDiscovery Today and has been sponsored all 4 years by EDRM. It's designed to reflect trends and sentiments within the eDiscovery community, and it's comprised of 2 components. Results of an industry-wide survey that we always try to keep as a very simple survey consisting of 10 questions covering trends in the eDiscovery industry, and then a cross-section of thought leader observations on those same trends. So we try to give you a couple of different ways of looking at the trends with this report. Now, the report is available free to email subscribers at eDiscovery Today, as you see there at eDiscoverytoday.com. If you go to the site in the upper right-hand corner, you can put in your email address to subscribe to the blog. Because of the fact that this is a report available to email subscribers, this is going to be one of the rare instances where we don't share the slides after the webinar, because we want to encourage you to go get the report, where you'll get what we're covering during this webinar and a lot more as well, a lot more of the thought leader interviews and much more details on the breakouts of the different response groups. So we encourage you to get that as a part of continuing to check out the results of the report. So, as I mentioned, we have issued the report for the last 4 years, and as you can see, we've been able to grow the report in terms of number of respondents each year. We started the first year with 183 respondents, and the next 2 years grew about 50% each time. And this year, we still set another record of 444 respondents to the survey portion of the report. So with all of you who are on this webinar who participated, we thank you. And in addition to that, we also have the number of thought leaders that have participated year over year. And as you can see, we had the same number of thought leaders this year as we had last year. And that's probably a pretty good max of where we'll have in each typical year. We probably won't grow much beyond that, but we certainly hope to continue to grow the survey portion to continue to get a broader cross-section of the industry. So a few highlights. The trends that we're covering this year include a couple of questions about new questions about LLMs and generative AI, including the experience that people have with the tools out there and what people expect the impact of LLMs and Gen AI to be on the e-discovery industry in 2024. We'll also touch on several questions that we have hit for the past several years, including percentage of firms using predictive coding technology and at what level, how many cases involving companies have data from mobile devices and data from collaboration apps. Our second year to ask a question about use cases for eDiscovery and how many different use cases are people applying eDiscovery workflows and technology to. The biggest eDiscovery trends of 2024 with a new development in that regard, and then the eDiscovery challenge not being talked about. So what's different in this report? As I mentioned, we have those two new questions about large language models and generative AI. The first 3 years, we asked questions about remote versus in-office work and in-person versus in-person legal technology conference questions that really tied to kind of our situation in the pandemic. And now that they have diminished relevance post-pandemic, these questions are so 2020, we've chosen to replace those with something more relevant and current. And then, of course, we made a few adjustments to selection choices for a few of the other questions. So with that, let's get into this year's report. So this year's report, as I mentioned, 10 total questions, 444 total respondents. Here's the respondent breakdown. The provider group was the largest group with 42.4% of respondents. Law firm second with about 22%. Consultancy nearly 21%. Then we had corporation respondents at 8.8%. And then, as you can see there, government, entity, and other. Other would be like media and other organizations. So you've got a sense of that there, and it's pretty comparable in terms of the respondent breakdown to last year. 83.6% of the respondents were U.S.-based. That's actually about 5% less than last year. So last year, I think it was 88.5% of respondents were U.S.-based. This year, instead of being more like 6 out of 7, it's 5 out of 6. And we have quite a bit of respondents, especially in Asia, as well as in Europe, both UK and non-UK. And a good question is provider both service and software. That is correct. Actually, when it comes to the question as we put it from a demographic standpoint, we say software or services provider. So it can be either accordingly. So absolutely, great question. So our first question that we asked from a substantive standpoint is people's experience with large language models and generative AI. Here are some of the findings that we see here. And as you can see here, with 444 people responding to the survey, close to about 2/3 of them are at least reading and researching about Gen AI technology, and close to about that same number has also at least experimented with a free version of ChatGPT. And then you can see a few other kind of numbers there, because I asked basically the question and had everybody select everything that applied. So there's about a little over a quarter that are paying for a ChatGPT Plus account, and you see other numbers accordingly. Two other numbers of note, only 11.5% of the respondents aren't doing anything with LLMs and generative AI. And right now, and it's probably not surprising considering that we're just really in the very infancy of it, only about 3.2% of respondents were currently using LLMs and generative AI for eDiscovery related tasks at the time we conducted the survey, which stretched from the end of October to the beginning of December. And then you can see here an example of one of the thought leader observations from Irfan there, talking when I asked the question, what's your experience with LLMs and Gen AI? And he basically said, hey, endless learning. I'm using it for all sorts of things in work and in life. And certainly I think that's true of a lot of folks.
Doug, was there anything about those findings on either the last slide or the current slide that struck you personally as surprising?
That's a good question. Let me go back to this one. I was surprised at the number of folks who have already experimented with ChatGPT, because I certainly know a lot of people have tried it out, but I didn't expect probably quite as high a percentage. And then I was surprised at a couple of the numbers of people who have experimented with other platforms. Like, we have over 1 in 5 that's experimented with image generation, like Dolly and Midjourney, and close to that number with Google Bard. So I kind of thought I thought that the numbers were more embracing of the technology than I might have expected. Wasn't surprised about the eDiscovery number being so low. A little surprised about the non-eDiscovery task being a little higher, but it's a little further along in other areas. So what about you? Any thoughts, any observations you have on the numbers?
Well, I think the fact that there are more than 1 in 10 of our community that aren't doing anything over the course of the last year is saddening to me, and I hope they can be brought out of what must presumably be their induced comas, because it's just been so hard to avoid any contact with discussion and experimentation with large language models. I suspect that some of them are actually using some implementation of a Gen AI or language model in some application, and perhaps it's so closely integrated to its operation that they're not even fully aware they're using it.
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct, and it does surprise me a little bit that people aren't at least doing some reading about it. So yeah, it'll be one of the things that'll be interesting is from year to year to see how some of these numbers change. And then what I do, of course, with each of the questions I ask is I do a breakout of a particular group. And the 4 groups I broke out were corporate, law firm, software and service providers, and consultancy groups. So I chose to put the corporate graph here. And as you can see, they're a bit less ambitious with regards to their embracing of LLMs and Gen AI. About half of them are reading about it. Less than half of them have tried ChatGPT, and 23% haven't done anything yet. So certainly some work to be done there. The numbers are more positive through the rest of the groups. Higher, about 7 out of 10 are actually of law firm respondents are actually reading and researching, and that's numbers even greater between providers from a provider standpoint with 72.1%. And providers have the lowest number of people who haven't done anything at 6.3%. And then you see the consultancy numbers there. And you see Kelly Twigger's quote there, which of course she also mentions that they've actually built in custom integration with LLM technology to summarize all the cases in eDiscovery Assistant, which has been a big value to me. Question, is there a difference between service provider and consultancy? It was really based on how the respondent classified themselves. I suspect that there are companies out there who consider themselves more of a consultancy, probably like the Big Four and things like that, who probably selected that box, and the versus companies that consider them more of a direct service provider. But it's a self-selected choice, so each participant in the survey identified themselves. So great question there.
I could underscore your shout out to Kelly Twigger, our good friend. She was really very early out of the gate in integrating these large language model features, and especially wise to choose the thing that LLMs do with the lowest risk and I think highest value proposition, which is the summarization of larger documents and information. And so for those of you in that 10, 11% who haven't been kicking the tires on these tools, that's an area where I think you can integrate large language models into your day-to-day practice without the same fear that's been sponsored in terms of the hallucinations, the making stuff up concerns that have proven almost paralyzing in some situations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the worst thing that you'll get with the summarizations is some could be a little more descriptive or complete than others, but it's kind of a no harm, no foul situation. I couldn't agree more, Craig. So yeah, absolutely great point. So we'll move on to the next category, which is LLMs and Gen AI and what impact they'll have. People believe they'll have on eDiscovery solution offerings this year. Not talking 5 years down the road, but this year. And nearly a quarter of them, of respondents, expect them to actually have a transformative effect this year, which is pretty amazing. You got to have about another half of respondents that expect that the technology will at least be used for new eDiscovery workflows this year. So that basically means just about 3/4 expect it to have at least some impact this year. And only 4.3% expected it to have no effect. So very interesting. Obviously, people have high hopes for this technology and in terms of how it will impact eDiscovery solutions. And I've got a quote here from Judge Goddard, who's basically optimistic that this will hopefully help us progress towards that just, speedy, and inexpensive determination of cases. That's certainly one of the things we always hope for with technology, and certainly these technologies have great potential to provide that. Craig, your thoughts?
I share the judge's optimism in most regards. I think my caution is there's no question that it will further speedy and inexpensive. Let us hope that by virtue of proper implementations, checking work, and accuracy, that it won't sell just down the river. That's my fear, is that we will embrace these things because of the cost savings without fully assessing the impact on quality. I am cautiously optimistic, as I think is Judge Goddard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the more I see some of the technology beginning to be implemented in eDiscovery solutions, I'm very optimistic as well. And I definitely think I would be classified in the transformative effect. Certainly not, if not this year, very close to it. From a standpoint of breakouts, I picked law firms are probably the least optimistic. One of the things that certainly is interesting is that corporate respondents are even more gung-ho. 28.2% expected a transformative effect, and 46 expected some effect. So very interesting there, and certainly very much optimism from the provider standpoint, although a little bit lower number on the transformative side. And while consultancy respondents were maybe the most optimistic on the top end, they also had the largest expecting no effect on the bottom end. And Judge Rodriguez, who wrote a terrific paper about AI in legal, talks about the fact that eDiscovery vendors are already incorporating it into their capabilities. And he wonders if we're going to start to have some of the disputes that we've had with regards to TAR. And I think that's certainly one of the things that will be interesting to see. Craig, your thoughts about, kind of some of those challenges?
Well, I think the upshot, the strongest positive in this, is that some of the reluctance to TAR may be the fact that it is not a language model. It's more a math scoring relevance approach in a non-semantic, latent semantic analysis. So what I'm saying here is LLMs are going to allow TAR tools and other tools to explain why characterizations have been made, to justify why something is deemed privileged, why it's deemed responsive or non-responsive. And I think that's going to effectuate a much closer, more confident embrace of these advanced analytics than we've seen here to date. So teaching TAR to talk is going to be, I think, the most significant achievement of pairing large language models with advanced analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I actually just sat in on a demo with a provider earlier today where they were showing that, and showing not just that the classifications were being made, but with the model identifying and describing why it made those classifications and what it honed in on, which is really great information. And so I absolutely, teaching TAR to talk is a good way of putting it, Craig. So I like that. I've got a couple of comments here from one of the audience members that talked about somebody, I guess I can mention company names here, discussion at the Bar eDiscovery Committee last year with working with Redgrave data and testing generative AI, but expecting 2 to 3 years to be honed in enough, as we saw it took years for TAR's acceptance. So I guess we'll see. They say right now it's still slower and much more expensive than TAR. But I guess that's one of the things we'll see. I think some other people I've been talking to feel like it might be a complete revamping of the workflows. So I guess we will have to see how it goes there. Corporate respondents, yes, corporate respondents are the least ambitious in terms of trying ChatGPT, but yes, they are also among most gung-ho for the transformative effects for these technologies. Correct on both accounts. What I suspect is that some of those corporate respondents may have been not necessarily personally trying out the tools, but maybe have had their providers kick the tires and provide some information back. So I guess we will see, but certainly I think that's what I've heard from a couple of corporate folks I know, is that they've played around a little bit, but they've also kind of gotten their providers to kick some tires to see what they find with the technologies. So definitely interesting points and questions. And we'll move on to the next section, which is our first repeat question of the year, and that's the use of predictive coding technology. So question is, what is all the generative AI going to do for people who use predictive coding technologies? And every year I ask the question, what percentage of your cases use these technologies? And 392 people answered the question this year, and we put these next 3 questions into 6 buckets. All of my cases use it. Most of my cases use or have it. About half, some, very few, or none. And what you see is 30.1% of respondents use predictive coding technologies in most or all of their cases. About a little more than a quarter, 27.8%, use it in very few or none of their cases. And 45.4% uses predictive coding about half the time. This is the first year out of the 4 years we've done the survey where the percentage of respondents who said all or most of their cases was higher than the percentage of respondents who said fewer or none of their cases. So it's definitely a bit of a breakthrough, as we'll see in a slide coming up here. And certainly, I think as Andrew Reuter says there from Simplify, LLMs and Gen AI may become the go-to approach, certainly for more investigative and exploratory reviews. So we'll certainly see what happens there. Craig, your thoughts about kind of the, how this impacts how predictive coding is, evolving as a result of all these technology changes.
Thanks. Let's go to the next slide. I think that the recasting of this information probably gives us a little bit more insight into the trend.
Okay. And absolutely. So here's again where we do the breakouts of the different groups. And the very top bullet there, 41.7% of corporate respondents saying they use predictive coding in all or most of their cases. And then you've got the breakdowns there. Now, one of the things here that's interesting, and I picked this group for this reason, you would think the provider might be the most enthusiastic of the 4 groups. They were actually the least enthusiastic. Only 25% use it in all or most of their cases. Only 30.2% use it in few or none of their cases. And I'm not sure if these are providers, all of these providers are ones that are really necessarily managing review, although I always give an A choice with this question. So if you're not involved in review at all, you can skip the question. but I thought that was interesting. And then you see the consultancy numbers there. And then, of course, I've got a quote here from Robert Keeling, who expects that LLMs will transform eDiscovery, and his firm, Sidley Austin, just did a terrific benchmark test, which was very enlightening. So certainly interesting he's got some real world experience of that. So Craig, what did you want to point out as we got to this slide?
Well, it really came home to me in the next slide where you try to show the divisions in terms of trends.
There we go.
If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, if the timing is right. Here's where I view it as kind of surprising. It's a little, as you noted, a bit all over the map. A fair amount of consistency, but it's hard for me to understand why we're seeing the kinds of changes we're seeing between, say, 2022 to 2023 and 24. It belies a consistent trend. And I think we've kind of plateaued to a certain extent on the implementation of predictive coding technologies. There's certainly a socialization towards wanting to say you use it. It's been around now a long time. Its use is kind of expected as a part of eDiscovery literacy. So I can't really make complete sense of the variations that we're seeing on these trend lines.
Yeah, and honestly, as I've conducted the survey and asked this question all 4 years, when you look at 2021 versus 2022, and we actually had a regression in use, and of course we'd expanded, the survey was expanded in terms of number of respondents, and then we've kind of leveled out. As you can see, 2024 in terms of respondents who use it for all or most of their cases still haven't gotten back to that level of 2021. That red line there, as you can see, 2021, we actually had about a percentage more. But we have now had a little bit, at least in this 1 year, of an improvement, a fairly significant improvement in the number of respondents who are using it in very few or none of their cases. So yes, it has been a little bit of kind of treading water, if you will, with regards to this category. And one of the things I think will be very interesting to see going forward is the impact of Gen AI. Will it start to cause these numbers to go down, or will it be a boost to the predictive coding numbers? And I honestly, I could see it going either way. And then, of course, Mary's got a great quote there about the validating of AI models and the curiosity of TAR products. It will inflate the interest in predictive coding, but since they're all AI, but as she notes, rightly so, they accomplish different functions with different protocols. So it will be interesting to see how that unfolds. But absolutely, this is going to be, I'm going to continue asking this question over subsequent years, and we will continue to evaluate those trends. And our next section was data from mobile devices. And we had more than 4 in 10 respondents that actually either always has or usually has mobile data in their cases, and not quite a fifth of respondents that has it rarely, if ever. So that's about 57% that has it at least half the time. Now that compares quite a bit favorably to last year, where it was 31.9% that you always or usually has it, 22.8% that rarely or never has it. So both numbers improved, and as you'll see here in a couple of slides, the trend has been improving overall. And of course, you see Matt Rasmussen there from Bode 1 talking about, in terms of catalysts to continue to grow, to have the to promote mobile device discovery. He's talking about the devices having been historically ignored, and certainly that's one of the things we've seen: blissful ignorance, cost burden arguments. Craig, you've talked about that. Any thoughts about the findings on this slide?
I'm just always impressed by the level of tenacity in belying the existence of something we all in our day-to-day lives understand is where much of the evidence is located, which Matthew Rasmussen rather artfully describes as it's being ignored behind the veil of blissful ignorance. Well, it's not blissful if you're the requesting party, and I think the judges need to step up and ensure it's not blissful for those who are continuing to ignore this very powerful and probative source of evidence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yes, a great point. A question, are rarely, if ever, mobile devices mostly in Europe? It's a great question. I will have to look at the numbers, and since I know who asked the question, I can certainly research it and maybe try to provide an answer on the email coming out. Because I certainly did a breakdown across groups, but I can take a look about the rarely if ever and how they shake out geographically. Now, when we look at the groups that break out, corporate respondents are the least embracing of mobile devices. And that's not surprising. Obviously, we've seen a couple of cases recently where, BYOD devices, BYOD policies were talked about and cited. But one of the things I will mention, even though corporate was the least embracing group here, was still considerably better than last year, where it was 54% that rarely or never had mobile device data last year. So close to a 15% improvement, and about a 2.5% improvement on those that have it at least most of the time. Improvement still, and then you see the other numbers there, and consultancy respondents really embraced it. More than half has it all or most of the time, and only 13.6% rarely or never has it. And Eric Robinson of eDiscovery points out, it's going to take more than one thing to drive adoption of discovery of mobile devices, and I certainly agree with that. Craig, any other thoughts on this topic?
I think
actually, let me move to the final slide here to show the trends, and we can incorporate those in that.
And I think it bears repeating in terms of the quote from the prior slide that what you asked the thought leaders to comment on were a range of things that are likely to have the greatest impact in terms of finally getting people to fully embrace mobile evidence. And so, you asked about whether it was going to be court decisions or something else. And so I think that quote really needs to be considered if you go back one slide, please.
Oh, sure. Yeah, let me do that. There we go.
And that's what Eric is saying when he says, I don't think it's just one thing. You had asked all of us to comment on the one thing. For me, the one thing was what I touched on earlier, and that was we need to be holding people's feet to the fire. I know nobody likes the word sanctions in the context of punishing people for discovery abuse, but that we never had much of a carrot, and now we've lost much of the stick. So I really believe the courts are going to have to continually emphasize mobile is where it's at, and we expect you to grapple. Of course it's hard. There is a commingling of the personal and the professional that is not simple to segregate, but simply throwing up our hands is not going to be the way to deal with mobile, and certainly not with all of the collaborative tools we'll be talking about shortly.
Yeah, absolutely, Craig. I agree. And based on the case law I've covered over the past year or two, we've had a bit of a mix. We haven't always had the courts holding participants' feet to the fire with regards to preservation, or requiring, in some instances, forensic examination when they've done so with other devices, like laptops and what have you. So I think we're still kind of, the courts are still a mix in terms of those directives, for sure. And then in terms of the trend over the past 3 years, the first year, rookie mistake, I had asked a combined mobile device and collaboration apps question. The past 3 years, I've asked a dedicated mobile device and a dedicated collaboration apps question. And as you see by the red line there, when you look at the all or most cases for the last 3 years, there's been a trend of improvement, a consistent trend of improvement. and as well on the few or none cases, the smaller those go on that side, the better as well. So we have seen a progress in terms of people with the number of cases that involve mobile devices, which is a good sign. So, and a comment from the audience, U.S. law firms need training on how to get mobile phones in at least Germany, and they're struggling significantly. And I can imagine that's certainly true. So a great comment from our audience member on that. So now data from collaboration apps. So this year, nearly 3 in 8 respondents had either always has or usually has collaboration app data in their cases, and less than 1 in 5 either never has or rarely has. So that's that's over half of respondents that have the collaboration app data in their cases at least half the time. And that's not surprising that that's the case because of just how involved we are with our collaboration apps today. And certainly Dave Rule of Hanzo mentions what a lot of people have been saying, that collaboration apps are eventually going to become the king of the communication world. And we're certainly heading that way to a large degree. And of course, he notes how LLMs will play a part in understanding that content and working with it. So when you compare to last year, the top number was 26.4, so that's about 11% improvement, and the bottom number was 32.1. Excuse me, the middle number is 32.1, so that's about a 13% improvement. So that's an indication of just how we're heading in terms of the direction we're heading. Craig, any thoughts on this topic?
I'm impressed by how neatly these numbers for collaboration apps line up on the mobile apps. And it makes perfect sense to me. Most of what we are talking about in discovery from mobile devices, I think tends to cluster around messaging, MMS, SMS, iMessage, WhatsApp, and so forth. And of course, the collaboration apps are also largely messaging tendencies. And so what these things are screaming to me is our community needs to do a better, more consistent, more effective, and more economical handling from point to point and production of all forms of messaging.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And when you break out here, you've got the consultancy respondents slide here, their particular breakout, and exactly half of them has collaboration app data all or most of the time. Corporate respondents not that far behind. They're 47.4%. Consultancy respondents are really wild because 2 years ago they had about 33%. Last year they dipped to 22%, and this year they're all the way up to 50%. So they're truly yo-yo dieting on this particular stat. But it's very interesting to see kind of how these numbers progress. And certainly Gavin Maines, I know you've done a couple of webinars with him, Craig, talks about the challenge of that we're dealing with, and these apps not being created with discovery in mind and playing catch up. And certainly that's one of the things it seems we're obviously going to continue to see new apps, and rarely are they developed with discovery in mind. Any thoughts about that, Craig?
No, except I agree with what Gavin's observed, and I certainly think that the EDRM is trying to push forward on finding some of the commonality, particularly with metadata values associated with the collaboration messaging as well as the mobile messaging. And so I'm seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm hoping that that light is an opening and not an oncoming train.
Indeed, and yes, great point. Because with the message, the standard message formats and things that EDRM's been working on, they've made some really terrific progress in there. And when you look at the trends over the last 3 years from a collaboration app standpoint, it's even more of an improvement over those past couple of years. In fact, actually, the number of people who have it in all or most of their cases this year is more than the number of people who had it in half their cases 2 years ago. So that's certainly a strong indication, as indicated by the red lines there, of just how many more people have this data in their cases. And we'll continue to ask this question year after year to see how the trends, if the trends continue or if they hit a roadblock. And certainly, Tom, our friend, our Santa Claus friend, Tom O'Connor, mentions about how Teams will be maybe eventually the default OS. Copilot will be make that process far easier, and AI assistants are a big part of it. He mentioned the Zoom meeting summary I mentioned in a blog post, and we're continuing to see more ways where all this stuff is integrated. Any other final thoughts on this category before we move on, Craig?
Well, as much on Tom's comment as on the category, which is I don't think we can underestimate the impact which Microsoft's M365 platforms, more coherent embrace of meeting eDiscovery obligations and duties is going to have. I mean, Microsoft, to its credit, is solving some of the most nettlesome challenges. And I'm not just being a toady to Microsoft here. I'm really impressed with how they're starting to embrace things like, you and I have talked about many times these modern attachment challenges, which kind of plays into the new media, the new forms, and the difficulties that they face. I think as Microsoft continues to dominate the corporate data space in data communication space and data storage space, I think that bodes well for our ability to get our arms around some of these emerging challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great point about the fact that they've done a lot from the modern attachment standpoint. In fact, they even call them modern attachments. And so it will be interesting to see how that particular challenge within eDiscovery evolves as we go along. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through the next category, which is use cases. Asked this question for the first time last year, and Repeat asked it again this year. And basically, it's which use cases do you apply eDiscovery technology and workflows to? Last year, I was very interested to find that 7 use cases were being applied by at least 40% of survey respondents. And once again, we hit that number. As you can see there, there are 7 use cases that have at least 40% of respondents saying they use eDiscovery technology and workflows for those. So I find that very interesting. And obviously, one of the notable things is because sometimes people use eDiscovery synonymously with litigation when it's really a workflow. It's a process applied to that. Not everybody uses it for litigation. 95.7% of respondents do, but that means 4.3% of respondents don't. In terms of big movers, privacy requests and incident response moved up the most at 3 and 4% respectively. So incident response actually cracked the 50% mark. A lot of people using eDiscovery workflows for that. Privacy requests up 3% as well. So certainly notable there. Craig, any observations from your standpoint?
Not really. There's a lot of overlap necessarily between investigation, incident response, and overlap between arbitration, litigation. So I don't find a consistent takeaway from this particular situation, except that if you invest your money in eDiscovery tools and workflows, you may be able to realize some return on investment in other areas.
That's a great point, way of putting it. Response to a couple of comments. Jerry notes that Microsoft is kind of changing their terminology and preferring cloud attachments as opposed to modern attachments. So great point there. And yes, we will be sending a recording after the webinar either this evening or tomorrow. So look for that. There'll be a link to the recording for you to check out anything you miss if you got to go.
And since you mentioned the word, before we just very quickly, we're all making predictions for 2024, and I believe that 2044 will prove to be the year of the war on the word attachments. There is a dedicated cadre of people in the community who just bristle at the notion that the word attachment is attached, forgive me, to any of these things, whether we call them cloud attachments or smart attachments or modern attachments. They just want to kill the use of the idea attachments.
Yeah, actually, absolutely. I've been kind of gravitating around the term hyperlinked files, at least with regards to those. Yes, there are a lot of people do bristle at the idea of it as being as being an attachment. So yes, I think the war is already in progress. Couldn't agree more. Corporate respondents had 3 use cases that hit the 50% mark. Provider respondents were the most diverse. They had 7 use cases, 6 of them over 50%. So providers, not surprisingly, because they're in many cases they're providing the tools, have the largest percents across the board there. Consultancy respondents fell back a bit. They had 5 use cases with over 40%. Last year it was 8. Karsten talking about obviously the use cases and the evolution due to generative AI and LLMs, and certainly it's changing really a lot of the workflows, and it's certainly more to come there. I know he's seeing that, and a lot of us are. So I'll move on to our next category, since I know we're running short of time, which is the biggest eDiscovery trends of 2024. And for the first 3 years, the top choice, each by increasing each year, was discovery of collaboration app data. Then along comes Gen AI and blows it completely out of the water. And close to half, 45% of respondents identified increased use of AI technology as the top eDiscovery trend for 2024. Now, I did add the phrase including generative AI to that. It wasn't there in previous years, but I don't think that really had much of an effect. Clearly, a lot of people see this, the increased use of AI as the biggest trend, and you'll see that across the groups as well. So collaboration app data, a distant second, and only one other category, which was increased use of cloud-based solutions, even cracked 10%. And about 3/4 of respondents selected one of those 3. And certainly Ken Grolich's response to the question from ProSearch just ties in nicely with that. Craig, any thoughts here?
Just that, of course, when large language models and Gen AI are put into the mix, they essentially squeeze everything else out. I would say, looking at these projections, that if you were to roll things back to a pre-AI world, let's call it the end of 2022, that the breakdown between the various subcategories hasn't changed that radically. Incremental changes, but no sea changes.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. So certainly a big upheaval this year from that one category standpoint. And guess what? If you're selling AI to corporations, they're buying, at least based on this. They certainly see it. More than half of them see it as the biggest trend for 2024. So that should be good news. And over half of law firm respondents see it as well. Actually, consultant respondents were the least enthusiastic, only 39.1%. And you can see some of the other choices there that were selected in terms of biggest trends. And Cassie Burns actually talked about some other considerations from a standpoint of mobile device policies as one of the biggest trends she sees. And the data sources are becoming increasingly popular. And obviously, companies leaning into generative AI are starting to focus on discovery issues relating to Gen AI apps. One of the things that I feel a lot of people aren't talking enough about is Gen AI is generating a lot of evidence, potential evidence that will be discoverable as well. So any thoughts about that, Craig?
No, I think we addressed that in your next trend line. So let's move on and save some time. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. And so our final trend is the question I ask every year: is eDiscovery challenge not being talked about enough? And in this case, as it has been for the last 3 years, once again for the fourth year in a row, lack of eDiscovery competence has been identified as the top eDiscovery challenge we're not talking about enough. In-place indexing and the move to the left of the EDRM model was second, although with a little bit of a drop. Discovery of collaboration app data and increased use of AI technology was fourth at 9.5. So believe it or not, there's almost 10% of the respondents who think we're not talking about AI enough, which is mind-boggling to me. But that's, go figure. But hey, yeah, I mean, we could just talk about nothing but AI and maybe they'd be happy. I don't know, but certainly, certainly lack of eDiscovery competence is still on a lot of people's minds. Craig, your thoughts about that?
Well, as long as we're boggling our minds, I was boggled a bit by among the 38 or so thought leaders that you asked and prefaced by saying, without citing eDiscovery confidence, what are we not talking about? And I was struck by how many of them just couldn't take that proviso and went ahead and in one form or another talked about the lack of eDiscovery competence. So even when you say, don't think about a rhinoceros, we can't help talk about eDiscovery competence. And paired as it is with the diminished ranks of expertise out there. I mean, the aging out, if you will, of the traditional leadership roles in eDiscovery, we're facing something of a critical shortage of expertise in the face of a widely perceived lack of competence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is the one category that I think I'm going to probably shake up next year because the past couple of years, and I should have incorporated it this year, a couple of people talked about pricing and about access to justice as being a challenge, and I definitely think that's one we should put into the mix. And certainly, Craig, you talked about something that we're not talking about enough, which is what the heck are we doing discovery for? And you had a great quote about that. I wasn't able to squeeze it all in, but certainly a portion of it there. And that's obviously one of the things that I think a lot of people forget about is what are we doing discovery for? So you want to add any color to your comment there?
Well, the only thing you really left out, as I recall, was I ragged the industry around a little bit by how many eDiscovery leadership roles are occupied by people who have never tried a lawsuit. And so I think as we get further and further afield from why we're in the swamp in the first place, we are seeing more waste, less focus, more efforts directed discovery for the sake of discovery. And I think that I'm seeing that on both sides of the V, so it's not just one side or the other. We've got to bring discovery back to its ultimate use case, and that use case is the determination of why something happened and who is responsible for the most part.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then, of course, you see some of the breakouts here at the different groups. Law firms were the largest group that in terms of the identified lack of eDiscovery competence as the biggest challenge not being talked about. And hey, the first sign of addressing a problem is knowing you have a problem. So that's always a good way to look at it. So certainly those are the results. These are feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions. We do have a couple of questions we didn't get to. I'm not sure if she's still on our attendee list, but let's dive into them anyway. Craig, do you foresee Google's Gemini and other multimodal models, say that 3 times fast, being used widely by legal professionals? Also, has anyone on the panel used multimodal models to assist in text and audio? Craig,
short answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
The short answer is absolutely. All of those, by virtue of Google making Gemini free and widely available, and of course all of us tend to go to Google first, I see Google and Bard having a tremendous role. And I don't want to be the prophet of doom. I think it's actually the prophet of improved performance. The unskilled and the if you will, the great unwashed, that sounds so elitist, but forgive me, All of these tools are going to bring everyone up to a sort of basic level of competence, albeit perhaps a level of mediocrity. But that's good. I mean, equipping those who are totally unequipped with better information and better skills than they have now, that's ultimately redounds to the benefit of the community at large. I do think that much of what we see being done by young associates, the grunt work by paralegals, the summarizations, the first drafts of interrogatories, requests for production, the first draft of responses, the drafting of objections and so forth. I think much of that drafting work, and of course the summaries, as we mentioned earlier, I think that's going to quickly fall to various implementations of these tools. They won't just be, say, Google's Gemini. A lot of them will be specialized, specially trained implementations designed for the legal community, which is to say LLMs that speak legalese better than those that have been trained on the internet at large. We should look forward to that because those are going to really help us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm already seeing some of the platforms out there. I just saw one earlier this morning that is leveraging Gemini and GPT-4 and Claude as well. So yes, I mean this is happening, and it's happening rapidly. And I think it's one of the things that we should expect to see. Also, a quote here from Jerry: "It'll also enable and motivate nefarious actors with deepfakes." So, detection and prevention of deepfake evidence is key, and certainly that's something I think Jerry's spoken about quite eloquently about several times. And absolutely, I think that's going to be a consideration. Authentication of the evidence is going to be more important than ever because there's so much you can be doing to manipulate evidence. So certainly metadata, I think, will be a key to that. Any thoughts about that, Greg?
It has always been so, Jerry. You're a forensic examiner. I am too. It has always been thus. One man's printing press is another man's counterfeiting tool. That battle, that cat and mouse will what keeps us all in business for many years to come.
Yes, job security. So I want to, I guess my final thoughts about the report is I certainly think it's signifying how rapidly the industry is changing, and also in a positive manner is beginning to signify how we're beginning to embrace some of these other forms of ESI in our daily in our daily cases and projects. And we're seeing considerable growth there. So I'm very interested to see what the next year holds. And certainly when I said last year, expect the unexpected, we had a very unexpected year last year in terms of things happening. I can't wait to see what happens this year. Craig, any final thoughts from you?
Well, if you'll permit me to bring it home, I'd like to say thank you, Doug, for not only for a wonderful presentation where you stayed right on time, but also for the work you do every day to blog for us, that you do annually on these surveys. They're some of the best insight we get in the year's time. So on behalf of EDRM, we want to thank our trusted partner, eDiscovery Today, for making this report available and their support of this educational and thought-provoking session. Our thanks to you, listeners, our eDiscovery, EDRM community, for your kind attention today. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, show Doug some love. Check out our resources at the bottom of your console and find some emojis. Send him a heart. Send him an applause. He's earned it, and he earns it every day. Share the love. We'll see you again on the EDRM Global Webinar channel. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Craig. I really enjoyed this.